We begin today with the message of defiance from the former director of the FBI, whose indictment last night marks a radical turn, a literal hinge point in which our country ceased adhering to one of the central tenets of life in a democracy. So begins an ugly new chapter in which an unpopular ruler purges his own political party of prosecutors until he arrives at the weakest link in the chain. That link willing to do what two Republican prosecutors in good standing with MAGA refused to do over a series of years. Here's former FBI Director Jim Comey hours after news broke that he'd been indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts.
My family and I have known for years that there are costs to standing up to Donald Trump, but we couldn't imagine ourselves living any other way. We will not live on our knees. And you shouldn't either. Somebody that I love dearly recently said that fear is the tool of a tyrant, and she's right. But I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. I hope instead you are engaged, you are paying attention, and you will vote like your beloved country depends upon it, which it does. My heart is broken for the Department of Justice, but I have great confidence in the federal judicial system, and I'm innocent. So let's have a trial and keep the faith.
Comey there is referring to a letter his daughter, Maureen Comey, wrote to her colleagues in the Southern District of New York when she was fired from her job there. Fear, though, is Donald Trump's favored weapon as his administration blows through decades of norms and traditions and begins to actually prosecute Donald Trump's critics, something Trump has wanted to do since his first term. Brand new reporting from MSNBC reveals that it is not clear if there was any prosecutor in the office willing to argue this case. And MSNBC also reports this now, quote, prosecutors in the Eastern District were confiding to each other late Thursday night that Trump's new appointee will have a difficult time finding even one assistant U.S. attorney in her office to help her take Comey to trial. After all, just a few days ago, according to ABC News and later confirmed by MSNBC, prosecutors in U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan's office wrote a memo explaining that they did not have the evidence to indict Jim Comey, much less secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. But Halligan went ahead anyway, as Trump directed her to do. The flimsiness, the lack of evidence and facts in the case against Jim Comey, as it appears right now, shows us one thing important about the second Trump administration. It shows us that after years of being told no, Donald Trump has finally found the people who are willing to go after Jim Comey in a way he has wanted to do for years. What his hand-picked attorney general in his first term, Bill Barr, refused to do, and what the special counsel Barr appointed, John Durham, also found no evidence for and refused to do. Bill Barr actually wrote about Trump's hectoring him to indict Jim Comey in his book. And he wrote that he told Trump that if the Justice Department tried to prosecute Comey for handing memos about his conversations with Trump to his lawyers, it would, quote, be obviously vindictive and, quote, meet with quick defeat, end quote. Now, in his second term, Trump can say, quote, nothing is being done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff, and Letitia? He can force out a U.S. attorney with sterling Republican credentials and relationships in MAGA Republican circles, including atop Trump's DOJ, who refused to bring the case against Comey until he finds that weak link, one who says yes, and get an indictment of a critic he's been obsessed with for years in the matter of days. The indictment of Jim Comey, a flashing red warning sign for the health of democracy and the rule of law in the United States, is where we begin today with some of our most trusted friends and reporters. Ken Dilanian is here. He is the justice and intelligence correspondent for MSNBC. He's been tracking the story for us all week long and all day, and he has some major new developments on the workings of Trump's Department of Justice. Also with us, former Department of Justice pardon attorney Liz Oyer. She was fired by Trump's Justice Department in March after she refused to restore Mel Gibson's gun rights. And former federal prosecutor Brendan Ballou is also with us. Ken Dilanian, I understand you've got news. We start with you.
That's right, Nicole. I think you sketched out the big picture well and the large stakes here, but there's also the small picture, which is what the heck is this indictment actually about? Because there's so little detail in it. And we had assumed all day long that this indictment had to do with James Comey's relationship with his deputy, Andrew McCabe, and whether he authorized Andrew McCabe to leak a particular story to the Wall Street Journal. But it turns out that's not accurate. I've just confirmed from a source familiar that the main allegation of lying to Congress in this indictment has to do with the allegation that James Comey lied about whether he told his friend Dan Richman, who was at the time a special government employee at the FBI, whether he authorized him to be an anonymous source for reporters about stories about an FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton. So Richman would be person number 3 in the indictment, we are told, and Hillary Clinton would be person number 1. That sort of goes against what we thought this indictment was about, and it raises this question, because we don't know what the evidence is that the government has supporting their allegation that James Comey lied to Congress. Comey testified in 2017 that he never authorized anyone at the FBI to be an anonymous source for reporters. And then when he was asked about that again in this 2020 hearing, which is subject to this, which is within the statute of limitations, he said, "I stand by my 2017 testimony." So it appears that the government is saying that 2017 testimony was a lie. You repeated the lie in 2020. And the way they would prove that is if they had evidence that, in fact, Comey did authorize Dan Richman to talk to reporters about an investigation into Hillary Clinton back then. That's a very specific thing, and so it suggests to me that they think they have something. And it changes the way I am thinking about this indictment. It doesn't change, however, the big picture that you described, which is that this is a case that career prosecutors inside that office and the U.S. attorney in that office did not think was worthy of bringing forth as a criminal case. And in fact, Eric Siebert, the U.S. attorney, was essentially forced out because he resisted bringing this case and also the one against Tish James. And we have new news on that score. He had a deputy, a woman named Maya Song, a very well-regarded person within that office. She was demoted when he was fired to prevent her from becoming the interim U.S. attorney because she wouldn't bring the case either. Today we have learned, my colleague Carol Leonnig, reporting on her day off, has learned that Maya Song was fired today from the Justice Department. So that bit of news, adding to this picture that the White House has essentially seized control of this Justice Department, and any figment of independence that the Justice Department may have had from the White House has evaporated in the Trump administration.
Ken Delaney in the New York Times reported last Friday night that Mr. Richman had been interviewed, I think about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, ostensibly by Eric Siebert or his deputies. Do we know if he was interviewed again in the period after Siebert was forced out? Because I think there were accounts saying that he hadn't proved helpful in moving toward an indictment of Jim Comey.
Yeah, I mean, I would be careful about, the grand juries are secret, and I don't know for sure, but I have no reason to believe that Dan Richman was interviewed again, and he did not testify before the grand jury. He was only interviewed, which suggests, that usually suggests that they believe the witness wasn't, in fact, helpful. But there are also a lot of documents, don't forget, that Kash Patel is rummaging through in different rooms inside the FBI because they are obsessed, remember, with this Trump-Russia investigation and what happened and what James Comey did and what people like Dan Richman did. And so they're going through all these documents, and it's possible they found something that suggests to them that they think that Comey authorized Dan Richman to talk to reporters. And let's think about that. Does that matter in the scheme of things? And even if that's true, there would have to be evidence that Comey didn't just forget, but that he willfully and knowingly lied to Congress. Why would he do that? He's a lawyer, after all. He worked at the Justice Department before he was the FBI director. He willingly testified in public. And why would he knowingly lie to Congress about something that really wasn't all of that, it wasn't really germane to the topic at hand, which was the Trump-Russia investigation. That was that hearing back in 2020. So I think, even if they have something that suggests that's inconsistent with Comey's testimony, it's a long way from that to a criminal conviction on perjury and lying to Congress. And that, I think, explains why so many career prosecutors were against bringing this case, Nicole.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered hundreds of top military leaders to gather at a Marine Corps base in Virginia next week. It's not clear why the meeting has been called. More than a dozen people familiar with the matter telling the Washington Post the directive was sent to nearly every top U.S. military commander around the world. That includes officials in conflict zones stationed throughout Europe, the Middle East, and the Asia-Pacific region. According to the Post, every source it spoke with said it could not recall a defense secretary ever ordering such a large gathering of military leaders on such short notice. Joining us now, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling and President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Good morning to you both. General, I'll start with you. First of all, how unusual is this in your experience, and what do you suspect is going on here?
Yeah, Willie, if this is usual and this is unusual, we're way out in terms of unusual in this one. It is never, that I know of, ever occurred in the history of the military where everyone is brought in. Now, certainly during wartime, generals commanding in a theater are brought in individually with their team, or the president or the Secretary of Defense visits them at their theater of operation. But I've never seen anything like this before, and it just seems extremely bizarre and strange.
Well, General, let me just ask you strategically, how stupidly dangerous is this?
It's pretty dangerous, Joe. What I'd say is, a lot of people are looking at it from the general's perspective, them thinking, what the heck are we going to hear? Because I don't think from what I've talked to some of my colleagues that are still active, they don't know what this is about. So it could be about a shifting national security strategy. It could be cuts to the General Officer Corps. Secretary Hegseth has mentioned that several times. It could be about the upcoming budget stalemate, or it could be concerns over information leaks or press leaks.
But General, don't they have communication systems where they can do that so we can actually keep our generals and our admirals in the field where they are needed?
Certainly, Joe, and they're called secure video teleconferences. It is the same thing as a secure computer, not Snapchat, not Signals app. This is no kidding secure stuff. It's just like a SIPR computer. But the problem is, when you move that many general officers to Washington, it's not just the generals that are concerned. I would suggest that both our allies and our foes are thinking to themselves, what the hell is going on in Washington? When a general comes into the Pentagon to talk to his boss, the Secretary of Defense, no one really knows it. There may be indicators. But when you're talking about publicizing over 800 senior leaders, commanders, as well as their senior enlisted advisors, their sergeant majors or their Navy chief petty officers, this is something that's going to garner attention, where people are going to say, what's going on with the U.S. military? What are they planning? Why is this so important that you're pulling 800, as suggested by the Washington Post, or more into the Washington, D.C. area? It's undescribable.
Yeah, and it's not just foreign militaries that are confused. Our own military is confused. Talking to some of these generals who have no idea why this is happening and are not sure why there's such secrecy. But we should note this. The military has different levels of classification. This one, we are told, is being deemed a secret level, which is not the highest level, because there had been some speculation considering our force posture outside Venezuela and the attacks on boats there. Could this be some sort of operational planning meeting? That seems unlikely, because it would be classified at a higher level, Richard Haass. So there's some speculation in Washington, people I talked to yesterday who were downright puzzled at this, that this could be just sort of almost like a pep talk. We know that Defense Secretary Hegseth is one of the things President Trump likes about him most is he's very good on Fox News and the like. The language about war fighters, a lot of it's PR campaign. And there's a suggestion here, taken in tandem with the edict from the Pentagon last week about reporters there only reporting on things that Pentagon tells them to, that this might be just a messaging meeting, but a very, very strange one.
And I think that's the most likely answer. If it were operational, you wouldn't have people globally. It would be more localized. My own sense, it's almost a cultural thing. Hegseth wants to change the culture of the military against DEI in favor of quote-unquote war fighting and so forth. He also wants to assert his authority, because there's been a lot of pushback. So my sense is it's more like that. But it doesn't change any of the ideas that this is expensive, potentially risky because people aren't at their jobs. It's just a stunt, and it looks truly excessive. There's easy ways to do this. We have fought wars in recent years, by the way, without people leaving their bases. That's why we have these secure video systems. When I was at the White House, we went through the entire Gulf War, and most of it was run that way. You don't need to do something like this. So this sounds to me something much more personal.
Yeah, even some Republicans rolling their eyes at this yesterday, saying that Hegseth, again, he and his senior leadership team, very depleted, perhaps out of their depth. Richard.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Tonight we're learning even more about how Donald Trump finally got the Department of Justice to go after James Comey, former FBI director who notably refused to do Trump's bidding in his first term, was fired because of it, a man who became a vocal critic of the administration after Trump fired him, a man who was indicted by a grand jury in Virginia yesterday on 2 counts, making a false statement and obstruction. Now, those indictments were secured by a first-time prosecutor named Lindsay Halligan. Big case to have as your first case. She was Donald Trump's personal attorney. She then became a White House staff secretary. And Trump handpicked her as U.S. attorney on Monday expressly for the purpose of bringing charges against Comey and perhaps some others. Today, MSNBC is reporting that when Halligan brought the Comey charges to a grand jury yesterday, she found herself the lone representative of a 300-member office spearheading a case that her predecessor and many of the assistant U.S. attorneys who report to her considered too weak to bring charges. Halligan only got 14 of the 23 grand jurors to indict Comey on those 2 counts, and they declined to indict him on a 3rd charge. So a little bit of a hair my chinny chin chin kind of performance there. In a series of social media posts after the indictment was announced, Trump declared justice in America and called Comey a destroyer of lives and a dirty cop and a lot of other things. Today, a reporter asked Trump if there would be more prosecutions of people on his enemies list, and the president said this.
It's not a list, but I think there'll be others. I mean, they're corrupt. These were corrupt, radical left Democrats. There'll be others. Look, that's my opinion. They weaponized the Justice Department like nobody in history.
There will be others. 8 months in, Donald Trump is making his personal revenge the law of the land. It is the most aggressively forthright attempt at suppressing dissent that I've seen in my lifetime, and I think that we've seen in a very long time in this country. It started with allegations of mortgage fraud against New York State Attorney General Letitia James, who successfully sued Trump's business for fraud, and California Senator Adam Schiff, who led Trump's first impeachment trial, and Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, who's the first black woman to sit on the Fed board, and who the president's currently trying to fire, although he's been barred by courts from doing so. But it's really accelerated in the last week. In the last week, we had Trump's FCC chairman going on a far-right podcast and openly threatening ABC and Disney and the affiliate networks to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air, ostensibly for the comments the late-night host made about Charlie Kirk's killer. And then just before the announcement of Comey's indictment yesterday, Trump signed an executive order in the Oval Office targeting what the White House calls domestic terrorist networks. But if you listen to White House policy advisor Stephen Miller, it sure sounds like they are talking about protesters and critics of the administration.
What we have seen, if you look at whether it be going back to the riots that started with Black Lives Matter and all the way through to the Antifa riots, the attacks on ICE officers, the doxing campaigns, and now the political assassinations, these are not lone, isolated events. This is part of an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. It is structured, it is sophisticated, it is well-funded, it is well-planned.
They want to go after anyone who opposes Trump because they think opposing Trump is proof that you are un-American, and because they want to consolidate a regime in a country where you won't have the rights that we've come to expect and enjoy. When asked about who might be targeted under the order, Trump named names.
Soros is a name certainly that I keep hearing. I don't know, but Soros is a name that I hear. I hear a lot of different names. I hear names of some pretty rich people that are radical left people.
George Soros, of course, the Hungarian-born American financier and Holocaust survivor who's donated millions to Democratic candidates and to progressive causes and to all sorts of causes. For years, George Soros did it has been a kind of grand unified theory of right-wing conspiracies and around the world, including right-wing populists and aspiring dictators in other countries. Well, now Donald Trump is ready to deputize the government to investigate him for what? For being an active member of civil society? I mean, this is it, right? This is what it looks like. This is what we have feared, what we warned about, the full conversion of the power of the federal government into a tool to suppress political dissent, to target political enemies, to make them into political prisoners. And as bad as all this seems, and boy, it does seem bad, I'll say this. For the pro-democracy coalition, for the pro-democracy majority in this country, I think this has also been one of the more encouraging weeks of this entire administration. Because this week we have seen much more fight out of both institutions and the American public that we've seen previously. There was the broad outrage over Kimmel's suspension, people canceling streaming subscriptions and joining open letters of support and protesting. There was Kimmel's own refusal to back down or apologize, delivering a pro-free speech monologue that was viewed by 6.3 million viewers, nearly 4 times its usual audience, and by more than 26 million people online. All of that public defiance, by the way, culminated in the decision today, wait for it, by the ABC affiliate owners Nexstar, the largest station owner in the country, and the conservative-leaning Sinclair to end their boycott of Kimmel's show and resume carrying on for their viewers tonight. And you could feel it in the case of James Comey, who immediately took to social media to announce that he is undeterred.
I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. I hope instead you are engaged, you are paying attention, and you will vote like your beloved country depends upon it, which it does. My heart is broken for the Department of Justice, but I have great confidence in the federal judicial system, and I'm innocent. So let's have a trial.
You can also see that defiance among the hundreds of prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia, all of whom apparently refused to join Trump's hand-picked U.S. attorney in her very first time before a grand jury in charging Comey. That courage may have been inspired by their former boss, Eric Siebert, who Trump nominated in May to be the U.S. attorney for that district. And Siebert, by all accounts, was a Republican, got along well with Emil Bovee when he was there, a Trump guy. But he basically got an ultimatum from Trump to prosecute Comey and Letitia James, and he believed there was insufficient evidence to charge them. And so he did the right thing and the brave thing, and a thing for which he should be admired. He quit. He said, I won't do it. Trump took to social media to say Siebert didn't quit. I fired him when I was informed that he received the unusually strong support of the 2 absolutely terrible sleazebag Democrat senators from the great state of Virginia. He didn't quit. I fired him. I'm going to be hearing from one of those Virginia senators, Tim Kaine, in just a little bit. But all this is more proof that as Donald Trump, tries to, in the most heavy-handed, ham-fisted way imaginable, criminalize dissent, create a class of political prisoners, throw his enemies behind bars, get them knocked off the airwaves, that patriotic Americans across the political spectrum are standing up and telling him absolutely not. Preet Bharara serves as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He was fired by Donald Trump in 2017 after refusing to resign, and he joins me now. It's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this case, and we're going to get into some of the details. Before we get into the details, though, I don't want to lose the context of this case.
The context is everything.
Yes.
It's actually entwined with the case. It's going to be entwined with the legal arguments that Jim Comey and his lawyers are going to make.
Insofar as you think, one question is, how much do they essentially say this is a malicious prosecution? There are avenues to get to a judge to toss it. One thing they may try to do is to get, we believe there's a memo circulating in that department where people said, we should not bring these charges and here's why. How do you think that will inform their legal strategy?
So, interestingly, Jim Comey, who I've known a long time, also, by the way, in your intro, Andy McCarthy.
At Fox News, yep.
At Fox News, and I were both assistant U.S. attorneys together in the Southern District. He's from a certain end of the political spectrum. I'm from the other end, but we both agree about the weakness of this case and the lack of merit in this case. Jim Comey said in his video that you played a portion of, let's have a trial. And maybe that'll happen at some point. Then a very good lawyer, and he has a very good lawyer, Patrick Fitzgerald, who's also an alum of the Southern District of New York, will almost certainly make a motion that traditionally, is a very, very difficult uphill battle to say, I was targeted and prosecuted maliciously, but the technical words are vindictively or selectively. It's a high bar because the judicial branch doesn't usurp the authority and the decision-making power of the executive branch. If ever there was a case where you could argue vindictiveness, it's this one. Those other cases tend to involve the exercise of someone's right to trial, and a vindictive, allegedly vindictive prosecutor punishes that defendant, adds charges.
Because they didn't take a plea.
Because he didn't take a plea.
Right.
And even then, it almost never works. Here you have not just a line prosecutor, a supervisor, the chief of the criminal division, the U.S. attorney, the attorney general. Oh, you have the president of the United States of America, who generally controls all of the executive branch. This particular president of the United States of America claims a unitary executive theory, and he can command anyone to do anything at any time for any purpose. That's quite a thumb on the scale. And then he commands his attorney general in writing publicly to go after these folks. And then after they're gone after, he celebrates it, he cheers it, and he pronounces them guilty. And says at the same time, I wrote this down from the talk, it's not a list. There are very few less reassuring phrases that I've ever heard coming from the President of the United States. It's not a list. Yeah. So they'll try that first.
So you've got this, what looks to all the world, I think, rightly, like a malicious prosecution. And one of the things that's interesting here, too, when you mentioned Trump is, there's a universe in which you could kind of try to gaslight everyone if you could maintain the discipline. Which is just like, well, yeah, it's we take lying real seriously. But he can't. He wants to crow about it. So even that
I thought it was a process crime.
Right.
When the shoe's on the other foot, it's a process crime.
Right.
Now, notwithstanding all these things that they have said about Jim Comey's treasonous conduct, suggestions that he should be brought up on the most serious charges that exist in the United States Code, life in prison, maybe the death penalty, it's one false statement that doesn't really have anything to do with those things. And by the way, the infection of the Trump spirit of maliciousness and vindictiveness and selectiveness, you can see in lots and lots of folks who are making comments about this, where there's actually not a lot of defense, and we can talk about it if we have time, of the merits of the case itself, of the facts that support the case, whose weakness is evident from a lot of things, including the grand jury vote and the rejection of one of the charges and the memo that those assistant U.S. attorneys wrote. But the likelihood that they can prevail, even if they get past a motion for vindictive prosecution, is exceedingly low. And all these people keep talking about that I mentioned, all the reasons why they hate Jim Comey.
Right. That's the argument.
And by the way, some Democrats hate Jim Comey because they think he handed the election to Donald Trump. None of which have anything to do with, almost exclusively, with the facts of this case.
James Comey, the former FBI director, indicted last night after a very convoluted process. We'll get into that. Because President Trump had literally admitted that he wanted to call the play and have this person indicted regardless of doubts and evidence problems within his own DOJ. Comey is now speaking out. When this news first broke about this within this hour last night, about 24 hours ago, we had just gotten the indictment, just gotten that news. We now have a statement from James Comey, which denies any wrongdoing. That indictment you see here is short in substance, in literal length, about a page and a half. And in the bottom there, it is short in signatures because this highly unusual, many say prejudicial process lacks the most recent U.S. attorney who's been there since Trump started this year, because that person was ousted, lacks the career prosecutors, just the lone signature of someone with no prosecutorial experience installed by Donald Trump, apparently, to get an indictment that no one else in his DOJ would sign. Now, it alleges that Comey knowingly made a materially false statement in congressional testimony and thus was trying to influence, obstruct, or impede what is Congress's power of inquiry. Now, the indictment is so thin, and sometimes indictments are sparse, but not usually this sparse when you're dealing with such a significant high-level former official, doesn't really get into the statements. But there is reporting that the government wants to go into basically whether or not Comey was truthful in referring to people who might have spoken out about what was going on inside the FBI and his views, basically authorizing a type of statement or leak. Now, the charges are rushed because the deadline was next week. The actual legal process of the arraignment for former Director Comey is October 9th. I reported this week that we are past the red line. that if you use the analogy of the boiling frog, when it comes to the rule of law, the frog has been boiled and it's dead. And we're now past the red line at a point where we are seeing how people deal with that. In the matter of unconstitutional attacks on free speech, we saw how big, powerful, rich executives might fold and then backtrack. We saw that this week. In the matter of the rule of law, we've seen how law firms and other individuals who literally take an oath, they're not just tax-paying citizens, they're members of the bar, how they have dealt with these efforts by Donald Trump to abuse power, to use the federal government to deny people legal services or make it harder with what are probably, some courts say, likely unconstitutional efforts to kneecap law firms based on their First Amendment and other legal rights who they associate with or represent. Trump's brazen efforts to do this have come with confessions in public. And in our strange time, our rapidly shifting media ecosystem, some people say, well, how bad can it be if he's saying it in public? But again, he has admitted to many things in public that he just wants you to accept. Whether or not a judge or jury ultimately accepts this case is one test. But it's not the only one, because there is a wider effort to abuse government power to not only go after people who have taken great risks or done public service or used their First Amendment rights to speak out against him. That is an issue that unites Jimmy Kimmel and James Comey this week in different ways, but government efforts to target that. Donald Trump doesn't deny that. They didn't deny that they were targeting Kimmel for what he said, and they don't deny they're targeting Comey for his, what they view as opposition to Trump, which is allowed in this country. You still are allowed to serve in the government and then criticize the government, or be a citizen and criticize the government. So there are big concerns here about the DOJ's independence. Trump vowing more.
Now that James Comey has been indicted, who is the next person on your list in this retribution?
It's not a list, but I think there'll be others. I mean, they're corrupt. There'll be others. Look, that's my opinion.
There'll be others, and that is his opinion. The opinion of a politician has always been, and the law governs this, different than whether there are facts to bring a case, probable cause to open an investigation, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to convict someone, and prosecutors who take those standards seriously and don't just accept the calls, even from important politicians. James Comey, who knows a lot about this system, he is in that rare position of going from actually overseeing these kinds of cases, developing the evidence, meeting with DOJ, running the FBI, to being on the other side of the FBI that develops these kind of cases and the DOJ that prosecutes them. And he says he's innocent, and he understands in the wider context why this is a time to also address other Americans about the fear that this president would want anyone to have just for being American, for exercising your rights. So here was Mr. Comey's response.
We will not live on our knees, and you shouldn't either. I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. I hope instead you are engaged, you are paying attention. My heart is broken for the Department of Justice, but I have great confidence in the federal judicial system, and I'm innocent. So let's have a trial and keep the faith.
Let's have a trial, which of course no single politician controls, even one trying to do all these power grabs. A trial, as we all know from civics textbooks or watching Law & Order, a trial involves other people, 12 of your peers. And Mr. Comey sounds pretty confident that if they don't get this case dismissed before then, and they have some good arguments before then, what are called pretrial motions with regard to government misconduct and other things. But if they don't get it dismissed before then, he sounds pretty confident that 12 people, hearing all the evidence, will acquit him, and perhaps few more negatively, the government's case and the sordid path we got here on. Now, what is in this two-pager I mentioned? It's a thin set of charges. The grand jury reportedly rejected a requested third charge against Comey. There's a form that shows they declined this additional false statements charge, which is significant because, as you probably know from the ham sandwich saying, grand juries tend to accept reasonable or well-presented government arguments and move it along. In fact, grand juries are generally kind of under the view that this is not the end of the case, it's the beginning, and if somebody's innocent, they'll get their chance later. But they hear out the prosecutors. They're a tool of the prosecutors, and yet on 1 out of 3, they said no already. We also have reporting that only 14 of the 23 grand jurors signed off on these counts, meaning there was already unusually high dissent on the 2 counts that passed muster. Legal experts say this is a pretty unserious beginning to a case against a very serious, respected government veteran, that it could end in spectacular failure, and in a sign of how we should cover this and whether people should just give in to Trump's effort to misuse the process to make everyone sound like a defendant and be on defense, a warning that this is now what prosecutors do in dictatorships. As for the path I mentioned, the prosecutor who brought the case is formerly Donald Trump's personal defense lawyer. And she is lonely as a legal matter, the sole signatory on that indictment. Usually you have several, which shows the legal process of people, again, members of the bar, signing their name to something that they think is legally defensible. She doesn't have experience presenting to a grand jury. Usually of a matter of this import against an FBI veteran, you'd want a veteran to do it, but she marched in there alone, apparently because no one else would do it, and senior prosecutors had already written what's called a declination memo ruling that there wasn't evidence to proceed on this case. Now, everything I've just told you is about why it's already this thin. But there's more. And the more is bad news for the Trump DOJ, which, make no mistake, is in crisis tonight. This is something that they did not want to do. This is some career prosecutors, why it wasn't brought as of last week. They got to hand that over, so we might see it. We might see moments that are described in emails or memoranda, descriptions of pressure being brought to bear, whether that's from the president or somewhere else. We might learn why, up to this week, Pam Bondi had not signed off on doing this, or whether she was informed, briefed, or agreed with the doubts about this very case. Remember, prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt Comey intended to lie to the Senate committee. Not that there was a misstatement, but that this was his unlawful, corrupt intent that day. And this brings me to the more. If you say, okay, well, people must have misstatements before Congress, sure. But that criminal level is a high bar for a reason. It's an exclusive, rare group of people who have ever actually gotten in trouble criminally for lying to Congress, and usually, like Michael Cohen, when there were other charges involved. Those convictions average out, if you do a rough count, and it's give or take, but it's not a monthly or yearly thing. It's about one a decade, according to an obscure study that looked at this obscure charge. And then remember the other side of the ledger. Donald Trump has weaponized and incentivized going after these kind of opponents. In his view, he sees them as opponents for many years. He was in power for a whole first term. We already know that Comey and his deputy were audited, which was unusual from a financial side. We know that they were investigated. We know that they testified. Remember, Comey went before Congress in a way that some other officials have resisted or delayed. He went and spoke under oath. So they were cooperating. And then they're being investigated for that cooperation. And this has been reviewed many times. I'll get into that tonight as well. And that's just Comey. There is a wider list of individuals that Trump has identified as critics or foes, and some are indicted, upper left. Some were indicted and the case already fell apart, the mayor. Upper middle, Comey, indicted yesterday and the case already on the ropes in a substantive and legal sense. Longtime conservative lower right John Bolton searched, which looks like they're developing a case against that former Trump appointee. And so this chart tells you a story. And it's the story we're covering at the end of a big week for America and the Constitution. And the story is it's not about red and blue or left and right. It is about whether you agree with the would-be autocrat politician or not.
Folks just kind of fall down. And now we're at a point where he can put all that to work to go after the likes of Comey, to go after Letitia James, to go after anyone he now deems has tried to stop his authoritarian reach.
I will accept your proposition that Donald Trump has far more experience than your average bear with our system of litigation. But, Michael, experience alone is not what allows somebody to leverage the ways that Donald Trump has. Normal people, notwithstanding their extensive experience with federal courts or state courts, don't become president and then immediately start dismantling the rule of law. So it's not
Fair
a
point.
function of just experience alone. And you're right,
Right.
he has often found himself on the short end of the legal system, but just as often he has managed to prevail, not on the merits, but by a strategy of what I'd call delay, stall, and ignore. His delay tactics and all of the litigation that occurred over the last 4 years is almost infamous. And yet, none of that should have allowed him to or gave him any insight into doing what he did here, which is just very simply ignoring civil service protections, stripping people of the tenure to which they are entitled by law, installing loyalists without experience. And I want to be really clear about something. Lindsay Halligan is not a dumb person. We keep calling her an insurance lawyer as if it's an insult, and it shouldn't be. I don't think I would be any better off after 15 years of being a commercial litigator walking into a grand jury room and trying to present a case to that grand jury. This is a question of subject matter expertise, not credentials. This is about, do you understand the criminal justice system? And I would submit to you that this is not a person whose life's work adequately prepares them for the job that she has taken on, much less to even be appointed as a line prosecutor in any one of the 94 judicial districts around the country that DOJ operates.
Well, I mean, look, her starring role, frankly, in this situation now as the U.S. attorney with no prosecutorial experience, her only experience, the reason she is most qualified for this job is because of her loyalty to Donald Trump. That is his own litmus test. And what James, again, this is not about James Comey, okay? He is no sparkling flower in the eyes of a lot of Americans, okay? I think Martha Stewart and Hillary Clinton themselves would both like to have a word, or millions of Americans in 2016, okay? However, what is happening to James Comey, it is bigger than him.
Correct.
It is connected. This is about the president criminalizing dissent, punishing people with whom he feels as though, it's a feeling. Matter of fact, it's a feeling. Punishing people he feels like he has something going on with, he has a vendetta. And he's taking it out on James Comey's family. I mean, look, former federal prosecutor Maureen Comey sues Trump administration over the reason they fired her. She's suing them now. His daughter, James Comey's daughter, his son-in-law, quit. He was an attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, the same office that just indicted his father-in-law. And when he quit yesterday evening, he cited that he did so to uphold the Constitution. Baby, this is not just about James Comey. This is about all of us and whether we are going to allow, as a country, the President of the United States to co-opt the Justice Department and use it as his own personal, I don't even know if this is a real law firm.
Well, and that is why every single American should be concerned. Because if he can come for James Comey, if he can go out and tweet to the Attorney General, this is who I want you to go after, and destroy these protections, we really are seeing a politicization and a weaponization of our justice system. But the other side of that story is that we have seen just this week, the American people do have power in using their voice. This administration was called on the carpet. And guess what? The Republicans that somehow some of them got some courage and stood up for the First Amendment for a minute, right? They didn't turn into a pumpkin after they did that. The president didn't come for them. The president's now trying to walk away from what he did with Kimmel because it was so unpopular with people and the American people stood up. And so we need to call on, where is everybody, right? And
can I just say, I know we have to go, but I'm concerned that those same folks that stood up for the First Amendment yesterday, Republican elected official after Republican elected official celebrated James Comey's indictment.
I agree, and that is the problem here. And that is what every single American needs to start holding people accountable. If you cannot do this to the First Amendment, you can't do it to Jimmy Kimmel, but you can't do this. The president, we don't live in a monarchy. This isn't a king. You can't, snap your fingers and say, go after this person because I don't like them, right? Or because I feel a certain way. And so that's what we need the American people to start holding, as they did this last week, holding their elected officials accountable. What is every single elected official going to do about this? Because guess what? The tables can be turned, right? And we don't want that to happen in this country.